This man crossed the same border checkpoint every single day. The guards knew him. They waved him through. They laughed at his monkey. Then, one day, they noticed the monkey could barely move, red-eyed, limp, sedated. What they found inside it cracked open a drug network, a forgery ring, and a disappearance nobody could explain. A quick note before we start. Instead of using the real names of the people in this story, I've replaced them with their roles. The retiree, the dealer, the wife, the friend. I did this to make the story easier to follow, especially if you're not familiar with the region. If you have feedback on that choice, drop it in the comments. I'm open to it. There was a Spanish retiree in his early 60s living in Ceuta, the small Spanish territory sitting right on the northern tip of Morocco. He had spent his career working for the Spanish government in civil records, and when he retired, he settled there with his Moroccan wife and their 2 children. He owned a house on the Spanish side and another in Morocco, just across the border. The retiree was a creature of extraordinary routine. Every single day, Monday through Sunday, rain or shine, holiday or not, he crossed the border between Ceuta and Morocco. Not once a week, not most days, every single day. He was so familiar at the checkpoint that the border agents practically waved him through without a second glance. The Moroccan customs officers knew him. The Spanish side knew him. Everyone smiled at him. He had picked up enough Arabic to joke around, and he always did. He had a small companion, a monkey. The monkey rode with him on most crossings, sitting in the car, leaping from seat to seat, performing for whoever was watching at the checkpoint. The retiree would laugh, the officers would laugh, and the monkey would perform. It was a daily comedy act. But over time, the Moroccan border officers began to notice something odd. When the retiree crossed into Morocco with the monkey, the animal was lively, alert, bounding around the car without a care in the world. When he crossed back into Ceuta with the monkey, the animal was sluggish, limp. Its eyes were red. It would sink into the seat, barely moving. The officers discussed it among themselves. Something isn't right. They flagged it with their supervisors and with police. "This isn't normal," someone said. When they began watching more closely, they discovered something stranger still. It wasn't always quite the same monkey. The animal's size shifted slightly between crossings. Its coloring changed, darker one day, grayer another. The differences were subtle enough that you might miss them if you weren't looking carefully. But they were there. One day, someone finally said it out loud. The monkey is stuffed with hashish. On a day when the retiree came through with the monkey, officers let him cross out of Morocco without stopping him. In the evening, he returned alone. The monkey had already been delivered, somewhere inside Ceuta. They stopped him. "Where's the monkey?" And when they finally intercepted a monkey on one of his crossings, they found it. The animal had been force-fed enormous quantities of compressed hashish, kilograms of it. That was why it arrived bloated, red-eyed, sedated, and why it was sometimes a different animal entirely, because not every monkey survived the crossing. The retiree was caught. The monkey operation was finished. But that wasn't the end of the story. When they searched his belongings, they found something else. A passport, a forged one, not his. And that passport would open a much darker door. In the city of Tetuan, a small mountainous city about 12 miles from Ceuta, there was a young man who had spent time living in the Netherlands before returning to Morocco under circumstances nobody talked about. Clearly, he was 39 years old. He was the only person in Tétouan selling hard drugs, at a time when hard drugs were almost unheard of there. Cocaine, in those days in that city, was priced the way you'd price something scarce and dangerous, the kind of money that cleared out a month's salary in an afternoon. And according to those who knew, the product was reportedly pure and uncut, not the diluted versions that would come later. He kept his circle tight and his sales quiet. He sold only to people he chose, through channels he controlled. And yet, the damage spread faster than anyone expected. There was a wealthy businessman in the city, the kind of man everyone knew. He ran the only luxury car dealership in the entire northern region of Morocco, selling Mercedes and other high-end vehicles when most people in the area had never sat in one. He had 3 sons. His family was the kind people pointed to when they talked about what success looked like. The sons crossed paths with the dealer through a car sale. They went to him as customers. He sent them away as addicts. 1 hit became 2. 2 became habit. Habit became desperation. Within a few years, the dealership was gone. Properties were sold off. What had taken their father a lifetime to build dissolved like sugar in rain. The sons ended up drifting through the city with nothing, sleeping wherever they could, eating whatever they could find. There were also 2 brothers from another comfortable family, sons of a woman who had been a well-known local entertainer. Their father ran a pharmacy. They fell into the same orbit, the same cycle, and ended up in the same place. By this point, the dealer wasn't just selling drugs, he was also selling something else. Forged documents, fake passports, residency papers, Spanish IDs, Dutch IDs, Moroccan papers. Whatever someone needed to cross a border, disappear, or become someone new, he could provide it, or find someone who could. The police knew about the dealer. They had informants. They had a file. But knowing about someone and being able to arrest them are 2 very different things. In Morocco, as in most countries, you can't prosecute someone without catching them with the goods, and catching the dealer in the act turned out to be nearly impossible. He never slept in the same place twice. He moved between apartments in the city and houses in surrounding villages. He didn't use a phone. Surveillance teams would follow him through the city's old alleyways, only to lose him when he'd slip through a building's rear exit, or jump in a cab for 2 blocks and vanish into a side street. He had been doing this long enough to know exactly what to watch for. The police shifted their focus. If they couldn't catch him on drugs, maybe they could catch him on forgery. Document fraud carries serious time, and the trail might be easier to follow. They tracked him to a village outside the city where he seemed to operate more openly. But before they could move, something leaked, and he was gone again. Then came an unexpected break. Someone had broken into the dealer's apartment in the city and robbed him clean. Forged passports, identity cards, photographs of people, cash, cocaine, heroin, everything. The prosecutor's office saw the angle immediately. Fine whoever robbed him. That person walked out of there, holding evidence worth years in prison, and they'll want a deal. The investigators leaned on the addicts in the dealer's network, people who were dependent enough to be persuaded and scared enough to talk. They didn't get the robber's name, but they got something else. A list of people who had been circling the dealer's apartment, in the days before the robbery. 5 men whose lives he had destroyed and who had reason enough to want something back. The investigation was building, slowly, but it was building. Then everything stopped. A long-distance bus pulled into the old Tetuan station, arriving from the city of Tangier, about an hour's drive up the coast. It was an ordinary run, the kind that makes that trip several times a day. Passengers got off, grabbed their bags, and went on with their lives. A driver noticed something left behind in the luggage compartment, several large black plastic bags, the industrial kind used on construction sites. Heavy. Nobody had claimed them. He opened one. The smell told him everything before his eyes did. Inside, the bags were human remains. What followed was the kind of controlled chaos that descends on a city when something unthinkable happens in public. Police, crime scene investigators, the prosecutor's office. Everyone converged on that bus station within the hour. The bags were transported to the morgue. The station was sealed. The bus had come from Tangier. There had been around 50 passengers on board. Investigators eventually traced about a dozen of them and confirmed no connection to what was in those bags. The rest were ghosts. The medical examiner's findings gave investigators the first real thread to pull. The man in the bags had 2 false front teeth, the cheap plastic kind. He had 3 small tattoo dots on his hand, the type made with a needle and ink inside a prison cell. 1 mark per time served. He had a record. His fingerprints were lifted and run against the national database. The result came back within days. The man in the bags was the dealer. The man who had evaded police for years, who had never slept in the same bed twice, who had moved through the city like he was untouchable, had been killed, cut apart, and sent back to his own city in garbage bags on a public bus. The investigation was no longer about drugs or forged documents. It was a murder case. While the medical examiner worked, other investigators went back to the dealer's apartment, the one that had been robbed. They had a warrant now, and they went in properly this time. The apartment was small, a bedroom, a living room with a couch, a small kitchen. On the table was a spread of alcohol bottles, some beer, some wine, and one that stood out immediately. Gordon's gin. The kind you'd find in an upscale bar, not the rough local stuff that circulated in working-class drinking circles. Gordon's gin in that city, at that time, was the kind of bottle that announced money. It wasn't something just anyone was pouring. It had a specific clientele. The bottle was partially drunk, but not empty. And crucially, when forensic analysis came back, the gin had been laced with a powerful sedative, a liquid compound that, slipped into a drink, would put someone under fast and hard. The picture took shape. The dealer had been drugged, knocked unconscious, and then killed while he was out. Someone had gotten close enough to spike his drink, waited for him to fall, and then finished it. There were no fingerprints, no useful fibers or trace evidence. Whoever did this had been careful. But there was one lead. A man who ran a small business near the bar the dealer had visited that last night remembered seeing him leave with a woman, young, tall, slender, with long dark hair. He had never seen her with the dealer before. That was it. One witness, one description. The investigation now had 2 directions to chase at the same time. The first led back to the 5 men whose lives the dealer had ruined. All five had motive that was hard to overstate. One of the brothers, the older of the two whose mother had been a singer, had physically attacked the dealer when they crossed paths in prison and had told him directly, in front of other inmates, "When I get out, I'm coming for you." The threat had witnesses, but when investigators looked at where each of the five men had been on the night of the murder, none of them had a solid alibi, yet none of them were breaking either. No confession, no physical evidence tying any of them to the scene. The case against them was motive without proof. The second trail came from the forged passport found on the retiree with the monkey. When investigators traced that passport back through its chain of custody, the retiree gave up a name. The woman who had been supplying him with forged documents, running the pipeline between Ceuta and Tetuan, was a 27-year-old woman, tall, slender, dark hair. Her husband was a man known around the city as a fixer, the kind of person who connected buyers with sellers and took a cut for the introduction. When they brought him in, he was calm. He knew exactly what to say and what not to say. He told them his wife handled her own affairs, that he wasn't involved in any of it, and that if they had something on him specifically, they should show him. They didn't, so they had to let him go. His wife was a different story. When they found her, she confessed to the passport operation. But that wasn't what broke the interview open. What broke it open was what she said next. She said the dealer had drugged her. During one of her visits to his apartment, he had put something in her drink. When she came to him afterward and confronted him, he threatened her. He told her he had photographs of her involvement in the passport network and that he would hand them to the police if she ever stopped cooperating with him. He was blackmailing her. She had gone home and told her husband everything. The wife reached out to a friend of hers, a woman living in the city of Tangier, tall, slender, long, dark hair. She was the kind of person who moved in the same circles, knew the same people, and owed enough favors to be asked for one. The plan was straightforward, in the way that the worst plans always are. The friend would go to the dealer's apartment under the pretense of a social visit. She would bring the Gordon's gin, already prepared, already spiked with the same kind of sedative the dealer had once used on the wife. She would get him to drink, and then she would leave. The friend didn't ask too many questions, or if she did, she accepted the answers she was given. She traveled to Tetuan. She went to the apartment. She got him drinking. She kept her own glass away from the bottle. When the dealer went under, she walked out of the apartment alone and headed back to Tangier. That was the last anyone who wasn't directly involved saw of her that night. The husband and the wife entered the apartment after she left. What happened inside, the narrator refused to describe in detail, calling it something he could not put into words on a family channel. What is documented is this: the dealer was killed. His body was dismembered. To slow down identification and sever the physical link back to the apartment, a finger was removed, the one that had been wearing a ring engraved with his real name. The ring and the finger were disposed of separately. The remains were packed into several large black plastic bags. The couple drove north to Tangier, loaded the bags into the luggage compartment of a southbound coach, and went home. They changed their address when they got back. Life continued as if nothing had happened. The case that had seemed impossible to close broke open because of a bottle of gin. Investigators traced the Gordon's gin by working outward from a simple question. Who in this city even sells this brand? It wasn't a common item. Gordon's gin wasn't something you picked up at a corner store. There were very few people moving it, and in the part of the city connected to the dealer's apartment and his usual spots, there was essentially one. He was an older man who ran an informal drinking operation out of his home, selling alcohol to a reliable circle of customers. He had a reputation, a nickname, that translated loosely to the perpetually dazed one, and 11 children. A character, by any account. When investigators brought him in and showed him the bottle, he confirmed without hesitation that he had sold it. And he remembered the customer clearly, because Gordon's gin was not something most of his regulars could afford. It was a tall young woman with long dark hair. She had a man with her. That matched the friend. Toxicology confirmed that the sedative in the bottle was consistent with pharmaceutical compounds available across the border in Sota, which closed the loop between the wife's network and the murder. The friend was arrested in Tangier. She admitted that she had gone to the apartment, that she had arranged for him to drink from the spiked bottle, and that she had left before anything else happened. She insisted she hadn't known it would end in murder. Whether the court believed her is another question. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The husband and wife were convicted of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to death. The 5 men who had been suspects, the dealer's former customers whose lives he had destroyed, were cleared. Their rage had been real, and their threats had been documented, but there was no physical evidence placing any of them at the scene. They were released. The retiree's case fed into a broader sweep of the border zone. The forged passport operation unraveled, pulling in dozens of people who had used the network to move documents across the Sota border. The monkey scheme became a kind of legend in the city, and for a period, any arrest involving an animal at that checkpoint got lumped under the same headline in local conversation. Epilogue: The Cost. The dealer was buried under his real name. The sons of the wealthy businessman were never seen recovering. The man who had once worn a watch worth more than most families in the city, earned in a decade, ended up on the street, his brothers with him. Their father's empire had dissolved completely, not over years, over seasons. The pharmacist's sons fared no better. What prison had briefly interrupted, the streets resumed. Somewhere between the first line of cocaine and the last, 5 men from families that had everything had become men with nothing. The dealer had not forced any of them. He'd simply been there at the right moment, with the right pitch, and they had walked in of their own accord. If you made it this far, you already know what kind of stories I tell here. Real cases, real consequences, told as clearly as I can. There are plenty more where this came from. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.